You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Seeking the Hidden Thing. It is my pleasure to have back again Athenian Stranger. Welcome, Athenian.
Thank you so much for having me back. I always love whenever I get a chance to talk with you about these things.
Yeah, and that feeling is completely mutual. The discussions that we have are always excellent. And in this particular case, we're going to intentionally get ourselves in trouble. This is a conversation that is resulting from a few offhand remarks in a group chat. And we said, rather than blow up this group chat trying to explain this to everybody, why don't we just have a conversation and record this? And so that's what we're doing. So what we're going to do this morning, or whenever you hear this, but we're recording it in the morning, is we are going to talk about Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction, and more broadly, the concept of the political, and why both the concept of the political and the friend-enemy distinction are so badly misunderstood and misused. And I think as a result, people are really missing, in many ways, the potential of what's there in Schmitt, because even though the friend-enemy distinction is today often applied within the concept of liberal, or within the arena of liberal politics, democratic, opponents, Democrats versus Republicans, left versus right, that in many ways these concepts can't even be applied in this concept, in this context, largely because they are a critique of liberal politics itself, that you can't apply the friend-enemy distinction within liberal politics, because Schmitt is using this context to say that what you're doing with liberal politics, party politics, Democrat politics, parliamentary politics is misguided, flawed, and ultimately dangerous for society over the long term. And so we're here to kind of maybe get your head right about the friend-enemy distinction, and hopefully you can gain some benefit about it. So maybe I'll let you sort of pick. You probably have a spot where you want to begin, Athenian. I'll let you maybe kick things off now that I've sort of framed this up for us.
Yeah, so the thing I had said in the group chat was that Schmitt is very important, but not for the reasons that most people that we see on X championing him for. And it comes back around to this notion of the friend-enemy distinction. But here's what we have to understand in order for the listeners to have a really solid foundation in what you had mentioned about the problem of liberalism with Schmitt. Schmitt is working in a tradition. And I need to be clear here. I'm not trying to simply contextualize Schmitt and explain him by way of the history that's going on. That's not what I'm doing, because he's a top-rate thinker. But it is important to understand the dialogue that is going on about these very topics at that time. We have on the horizon Nietzsche. What Nietzsche has done is he has blown up the very concept of everything that was considered to be great about not simply Germany of the late 19th century, but the entire Western world. Now, no one really paid much attention to him at all until, see, Nietzsche dies in 1900. And then all of a sudden, we have the First World War. That's going to be the kicker, where most people start to say, you know what? This guy, Nietzsche, might actually have been right. And the person who's going to do that more than anything is going to be Max Weber. And it is Weber more than anybody else. People have to understand, Max Weber was the leading, he was the most renowned, what we would think of as an intellectual in all of Germany at this time. That's the person, primarily, who Schmitt is going to be having this dialogue with, along with, on the other hand, Leo Strauss. Now, let's just sort of be clear about exactly what Nietzsche has handed to the Germans in their defeat, right? Because Schmitt's going to publish his first book in, I think it's 1922, Political Theology. Weber gives his amazingly popular lecture called The Vocation of Politics, Politics as a Vocation, in 1919. It's published in 1919. And it is to the most talented youth in the universities. And it takes everyone by storm. Now, what's happened is Germany has lost the war, and they've literally just had a communist revolution. I mean, it's 1990, right? But this is what Nietzsche hands everyone about this thing known as liberalism, that they were all intoxicated with. I mean, liberalism is the modern Enlightenment, which is to say, it is, by the way, and this is important, this notion of modern science. And modern science has become modern politics through this thing known as technology, or what we would think of as managerial sciences and things. And so just 2 points for Nietzsche. Now you can go anywhere, there's a number of points, but these are important. This is Beyond Good and Evil, 199. And what Nietzsche says is the herd instinct is inherited best. He says at the expense of the art of commanding. Okay, so we lose the art of commanding or governing because of the inheritance of the herd instinct. Now, he says, if we imagine this instinct progressing for once to its ultimate excesses, then those who command and are independent would eventually be lacking altogether, or they would secretly suffer from a bad conscience, and would find it necessary to deceive themselves before they could command, as if they too merely obeyed. He says, this state is actually encouraged in Europe today. He says, I call it moral hypocrisy in those commanding. He said, they know no other way to protect themselves against their bad conscience than to pose as the executors of more ancient or higher commands. That's going to be he's talking about the stilted nature, the fraudulent nature, the very superficial nature of romanticism. Now, that's going to be crucial. And we could go into an explanation of romanticism, but I'm doing an entire series on all this stuff, but we'll just leave it at that for a moment. Now, in his masterpiece, which he's already written, this is the kicker. He has an entire section in Zarathustra. It's book 1 or part 1, section 11, called On the New Idol. So there's something new under the sun. Well, what is that new idol? Nietzsche calls it the coldest of all colds, the state. The state is the new idol, and it's because it has become mechanized or made scientific through the methods of modern science, which have a dehumanizing effect. Now, so we can leave it at that. Now, also, by the way, he does almost immediately thereafter, he has another session titled On the Friend. And what Nietzsche says about the friend is he says, our greatest weakness, effectively, is in our friends. Now, that's been misunderstood because people are saying, well, Nietzsche, the role of friendship was always absolutely definitive of the practice of the philosophical life. That's why we find it in Aristotle. That's why we find it in Plato. But it disappears in modernity, particularly with Hobbes. which is, again, is going to be important. But we still see it in Montaigne, but then it disappears. And Nietzsche's the last one to really sort of talk about it. And because of the way Nietzsche says our greatest weakness is in our friendships, they say that that was it. That's it. The friend is gone out of the study of philosophy altogether, but they've misunderstood it, because what Nietzsche says is we can never dress ourselves up or adorn ourselves too much for our friends, because he says that's going to be our strength. Friendship is our fundamental strength, because that's where the greatest agon, the contest to become more noble, takes place, is between friends. So, that being said, then you get to Weber's Politics as a Vocation. And what Weber is doing is he is trying to offer a critique, but still a kind of defense of liberalism, having deeply read Nietzsche and having been thoroughly disillusioned. This is 1919, by the complete failure, the defeat of Germany in World War I. They have capitulated. And he actually even talks about the problems with capitulation between men of honor in this essay. But this is what we get from Weber. By the way, Weber in this essay is going to give us the phrase, the Mandarins. That's where all that Mandarin literati and stuff comes from. This is from Weber. But that's a sidebar. What Weber says, and this is what Schmitt is going to fundamentally be responding to against, is Weber talks about the secularization of society from its historical origins or tradition in the medievals and early modernity. And what he's going to say, what he does, well, there's two lectures he gives. It's Science as a Vocation and then Politics as a Vocation. I would strongly encourage everyone to read Politics as a Vocation. Weber's going to hit all the high points. He's going to talk all about the role of violence. He's going to talk all about the role of the sovereignty. He's going to tell us what the state is. And in fact, while I'm at it, let me just tell you what he says the state is, because this is important. This is everything that Schmitt is going to be using and working and being in dialogue with. What Weber says of the state is, he says, here's the problem. He talks about the machine. In other words, modern science has created the political machine. And it's that political machine that produces this dehumanization. And this is what he says. He says, so this is the state, according to Weber. And remember, Weber is so influential that this is what everyone in Germany is going to say. He's right. And this is what he says. He says, if you take such and such a stance, then, according to all scientific experience, you have to use such and such a means in order to carry out your conventional practice, or your conviction practically. And he says, now these means are perhaps such that you believe you must reject them. He says, then you simply must choose. Okay, there you're at the role of decisionism. He says, then you simply have to choose between the end and the inevitable means. And he says, does the end justify the means, or does it not? And he says, the teacher can confront you with the necessity of this choice. And what Weber then says is, he says, this is our situation now in Germany. He says, there is only the choice between leadership democracy with a machine. So leadership democracy with a machine, in other words, that dehumanizes the human. He says, and leaderless democracy. And he says, namely, the rule of professional politicians without a calling, without the inner charismatic qualities that make a leader. And this means what the party insurgents in the situation usually designate as the rule of the clique, right? The cliquishness. Now, that's crucial, because what Weber is then going to say, I mean, he explicitly says this. And keep in mind, Weber founds modern sociology as we understand it, but also philosophy of science. And all of this is from Nietzsche, taking Nietzsche serious in the aftermath of the First World War. Weber flatly says politics as a vocation is tragic because fundamentally nothing really changes by way of your involvement in it because of the machines. That's going to be everything. And what he's going to say is there are two fundamental possibilities. You can either live for a universal end. He calls it, these are the ethics. You can live for a universal end, and he's going to explicitly associate that not simply with Christianity, but the Sermon on the Mount. He's going to say these are the only two alternatives. You have that, or you have an ethic of responsibility, and this is going to be a kind of situational ethics. And he's going to say that that is the only real option going forward. He says, and remember, he's talking to the most talented students. They've invited him here. I mean, it's in the opening sentence. He says, look, you guys invited me, but I'm telling you right now, you're going to be disappointed with what I say. It's in the opening sentence. So it's fundamental. Politics is fundamentally tragic, but he still finds a way to defend liberalism while critiquing it at its core in science. And he's going to say, I mean, he's just flatly going to say, I mean, the words he uses are just absolutely, I mean, he calls it a plebiscite leadership. And he over and over refers to modern disintegration of the human soul itself because of politics. And he says, if any of you choose politics, he says, I'm telling you right now, you will fundamentally have to choose violence, because violence is the primary means of all political action. And he said, what that means is that you are going to compromise yourself if you have an ethic of a fundamental end ethic. In other words, what he's thinking of is the Christian Sermon on the Mount, that let me rephrase it better. Universal. He's talking about the belief in truth that does not change through time. It has principles. We call them virtues. Nietzsche is the one who introduces the word values, because he's saying, no, there's no such thing as truth. There's just shades of things. And so we can create our new things. And Weber says you have to go into politics if you're going to, and I strongly suggest you do not. He says, if you're going to, you have to live by an ethic of responsibility, which is to say you are accountable for the consequences of everything you do in politics, or what gets done as a result of you being in politics. He says, the Christian soul, he flatly says it, the Christian soul cannot endure in politics. And he flatly says it, Christians should not involve themselves in politics at the public level. This is fundamentally going to what Schmitt is absolutely going to be against, particularly with the friend-enemy distinction, because that's going to be the element or the bedrock foundation of what he's going to say the political truly is. In other words, he's going to say that Weber gets it wrong about what the political is. And Weber tells us what the political is in that essay. And it's thoroughly defined by modern science, and which is to say liberalism. And what Schmitt is doing in other words, politics as a concept, right? The concept of the political. We have to understand what a concept is. It means this is rock bottom, bedrock. This is absolutely what it is. And he's going to say that the concept of the political, or the political as such, is the friend-enemy distinction. Now, that allows Schmitt to bring back Christian, because we have to understand Schmitt fundamentally is a Christian. It seems rather baffling based on so much of what he says and everything, but he is a believer. He understands himself as a Christian, and that's how Schmitt is going to bring theology back into the political. In other words, that men can still be politicians, and in fact, Christian politicians. And that's what's going to lead Schmitt into Hobbes, and say we've got to go back and fully understand how it is that these modern concepts, this modern concept of the state, has been a secularization of the pre-modern understanding of what the political was. Now, well, what were those? And I'll land it here, and we can, and because I've got more to say, but we'll just leave it there. But these are some of the vestiges of the pre-modern understanding of the state, which were thoroughly theological. The state of nature. Think of the story of Genesis. That is radically altered in modernity. Providence. God's omnipotence. All of these things are going to be what Weber and Schmitt are going to say have been thoroughly secularized. And so the concept of the political for Schmitt, and this is what's so wonderful about it, it enters onto our horizon as a hermeneutical problem. In other words, we have not been able to properly interpret the phenomenon because it has been secularized. And if we were to understand how it has been secularized, we might be able to salvage something. But what Schmitt is going to say is you cannot salvage liberalism, because that's what liberalism does, is it secularizes everything. In the way that Schmitt phrases it, his two key words are the neutralization or the depoliticization. Now think about what that means. The depoliticization, if the concept of the political is fundamentally the friend-enemy distinction, then the depoliticization means no friends, no enemies. In other words, mere comfortable life. That's liberalism, to make everything comfortable, to make no conflict even seem like it's needed. And Schmitt's going to say, no, conflict is what defines the notion of the political. So okay, thanks for letting me get that monologue out.
No,
okay.
There's so much, like there's so much there. And maybe just to tie it back, some of these, just to pick up on some of the threads that you've done. So, you have Schmitt in the critique of liberalism, right? So there is the critique of individualism, and this idea that, and you get this through political romanticism, that from the perpetual conversation between individuals, and that then in this conversation between perpetual individuals, as long as it is continued to be open and free, that truth, and to use a modern term, truth will be the emergent property that comes from the conversation of free individuals in the liberal context, right? So then that notion of political liberalism, or of political romanticism, of the ongoing conversation that then allows truth to come as an emergent property, is instantiated in the institution of the parliament. Now, Schmitt will then break down the problems of that in The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, and why that's a problematic idea. That once you instantiate this ongoing conversation in the pursuit of truth into an institution like a parliament, the whole thing begins to break down for various reasons. And he deals with that there. But then there's also, like, as you say, there's the other threads that come in. So there is this notion in liberal technocracy, the idea that we can set up a system of law that then will replace the function that God and metaphysics used to take place in society. So we can establish a law, a system that will protect the people, and, as you say, allow us basically to have this kind of peaceful existence that's free from political
Right.
conflict.
And that's
because the law will, in a sense, resolve all disputes between us.
Right. And that, by the way, is going to be the modern concept of natural law. And this
and
is
the
the sort
rule
of
of law.
right, because remember, he's looking at at how things have become secularized. Well, last time I checked, natural law prior to modernity uh, is most powerfully stated, for instance, by Thomas Aquinas or something like this. It grounds the entirety of morality. That gets changed, especially with Hobbes, through the state of nature, because he says, look, the state of nature is fundamentally horrific, absolutely horrific. And so we cannot agree at all to whatever this greatest good is, but we can agree to what the greatest bad is. The greatest bad is just bloody, gruesome murder, rapage of your loved ones, yourself, etc. So and this is the claim by Hobbes, is that natural law is the law of self-preservation. Now, and let's keep in mind, because what's going on here, law, nomos, this is also going to be extremely crucial for Schmitt, because in his last book, he's going to write, the nomos of the earth, etc. But that's key. And just one last thing I would add, because what Hobbes does is that Hobbes provides the scientific understanding of politics. This is how political philosophy gets transformed into political science. That's why you no longer have political philosophy departments. You have political science departments. And the way, and so what is going on with Weber and with Schmitt being in dialogue with him, and with issuing from Nietzsche, is that they've now seen the great problems with science. And so the overall consensus, at least that's going on in Germany, and it's going to sweep the rest of the world, is that, look, we can't turn to science to ground the legitimacy or the authority of any of our sacred ideals. So what are the alternatives? Well, in Germany, at least, you're going to have, well, there's one alternative, revelation, God. And that's going to be represented by the so-called new thinking, right, of Karl Barth, Franz Rosenzweig, or however you want to pronounce it in German. And then you're also going to have this other alternative, which will be Schmitt, of absolute obligation, duty. In other words, liberalism, modern science, the science of governance, right? Managerial science, everything. What are the human resources departments, right? Heidegger, by the way, in his question concerning technology, the first example he gives of the problem of science itself, of technology, is the HR department, which I find absolutely hilarious. And so they're turning away from science and looking for things that can legitimize the most sacred things of life that are worth living for, that actually make politics itself possible. And so that's what's going on there with Schmitt, and that's how law gets brought into it. This what he's going to say, nomos, or the rule of modern natural right, or law, etc.
It is interesting, like as you mentioned too, though, that there are multiple streams going on, because Schmitt, on the one hand, is part of modernity in a sense that he is not arguing against what, the sort of the moment in history, like the scale of modern society. So he still accepts the state as an entity, but he's looking to, like, how do you ground the state in a sense? What is its philosophical ground? What is the thing that anchors the state? And so his criticism, in some sense, of liberalism in the modern era is that liberalism cannot provide a grounding for the state. And this is one of the things that he gets into with political theology, is that the old way that governance was grounded through the personage of the king was that he calls it the miracle of law. And so, he is who is sovereign is, the sovereign is he who decides the exception. This is ultimately a metaphysical concept. right? And he says it has its roots in metaphysics. And so this idea of the miracle of the law is that Schmitt says there's always going to be situations that the system of law that you have set up as a liberal, that they cannot account for. There's going to be a crisis, and this crisis is going to come, and it will be either a crisis in the system itself, or it'll be an outside crisis. But for whatever reason, the current system of law will be incapable of resolving the crisis that, and he has a word for it, and it's just escaping me right now. But that in this moment of crisis, somebody will have to pronounce law. In a sense, they have to take the system, set it aside, and kind of remake the system in that regard. And he calls this the miracle of law. And what he's basically hinting at, again, is this is the way that sort of continental scholarship does it, rather than simply stating a theological concept to say that, well, in the old days, the king was the representative of God on earth. And when the king pronounced laws, it was as if God was pronouncing. So in a sense, the king could write law ex nihilo because he was, in this sense, manifesting a miracle among the people, in a sense. And the miracle that gets manifested among the people is this writing of new law that sort of comes out of quote unquote nowhere, but we know it comes out of, it comes from God through the person of the king. And even if it's never necessarily said out loud, and in many ways, excuse me, this notion of the divine right of kings is in many ways a corruption of that idea that was more implicit. In the Germanic, you would have like sort of the magic blood, that there was something special about the chieftain or whatever that would allow him to lead. And so they recognize that the hand of God is upon this person. He has the gift of charisma. And because the hand of God is upon this person, he can then pronounce law. And so Schmitt then argues in political theology that liberalism cuts the moorings, or it basically cuts the ties to metaphysics. And he says once that tie is cut, you can't just repair it and now say, well, the king has the hand of God upon you. And this is, in a sense, why he goes down the path of decisionism, because then what is it that replaces the hand of God? It's the will of the dictator. The will of the leader then becomes the modern presence of the will of God among the people, which in many ways is, even Schmitt is willing to admit that it's a poor substitute for what has been taken away from it. But he's trying to, in a sense, recapture a fundamentally metaphysical idea within the trappings of the modern state. And then this becomes important in a sense because this idea of the perpetual conversation, if you're looking to say someone like Clausewitz, who writes on military theory, coming out of the Napoleonic era. And, this is with embracing liberalism. Clausewitz makes the declaration that war is what happens when diplomacy breaks down. When discussion is no longer possible, then the only recourse you have is then war. And so then, Schmitt then placing this into the context of political romanticism and the perpetual conversation and this idea that truth is an emergent property. So he basically argues, he said, well, from this perspective, war is what happens when this process of individuals coming together to have this perpetual conversation, when this whole process breaks down, then you're forced to resolve it at the very end by conflict. And Schmitt then, in the concept of the political, flips it around and says, no, inherently, you aren't a universal man. You are made up, you are situated, and you are part of a people, a group. And this group then has a desire to survive as a group. And so you have an existential desire to continue as a people, whether that's a tribe, but you have a shared bond. And in this shared bond, you say, I'm willing to die for members of this group to allow us as a group to continue. And so Schmitt then argues in the concept of the political that the state, the governing authorities, their foundation, their legitimate foundation, rests upon an expression of this people's desire to survive. So the people's desire to survive is then instantiated into a series of institutions that are then invested with power, in this sense, by the people, but not so much by the people, but by the people's desire to continue and exist as a people. And this, he argues, is very fundamentally different from the liberal idea of individualism, where you have these universal ideas that are meant to be instantiated in state institutions that are designed to protect the individual rights of people. And Schmitt then argues that, you know, in a sense, what was done in America and France at the time was basically an anti-state, because you deny the people, you deny that there's a collective life. All there is that the individual, and the individual then, through a social contract that is somehow negotiated between people, develops a set of institutions to protect their own rights from their fellow citizens, and for also, and bizarrely enough, to protect their own individual rights from the state itself, which they've instantiated in the state. Which, you know, it doesn't make sense, but you know, it sort of works when you squint at it, I guess, from that kind of the expression of the period, that you could instantiate a series of institutions that would protect you from those institutions. But so then Schmitt then basically argues that this American system is basically an anti-state, and there's no one protecting the life of the people because there's no recognition that you have a people. And as a result, you don't really have politics in the US. You have this perpetual conversation, you have these institutions, but you don't really have the political, because the political is fundamentally an expression of a people's desire to survive. And this people's desire to survive is necessary because a people in a world that's dangerous, in other words, in a world that is sinful, you know, this Hobbesian reality, that other groups of people threaten you. And so you band together, you are a people, and you say, together we're going to survive, and against these other people, the enemy. And, you know, we might like them even, but they are a threat to us. And, you know, we don't hate them, but we just recognize that they're a threat. And so because I identify with these friends against the others who are dangerous, and so he argues that talking, when you do talking in politics, it's largely, and you're doing diplomacy. Diplomacy is in a sense just war, but in verbal terms, that you're fighting, you're already engaged in a battle with your hostile neighbors, but you're just doing so with words instead of weapons. And so you're always in the sense a constant war footing as a people. Now you can kind of see the Prussian identity in this, and it's a very Prussian idea, and you can see it sort of expressing in its momentary culture. But this is kind of the idea for Schmitt, is that in response to the universalism, in response to the romanticism, in response to liberalism shearing away the metaphysical, Schmitt is trying to ground the justification for the state in the people's desire for survival. And there he finds something real that can replace the old metaphysical order that has been cast aside because of liberalism. And that, in a sense, is why, you know, when you talk about the friend-enemy distinction, to talk about it, say, you know, Republicans versus Democrats, it's just a fundamental misuse of the idea, because you can't understand who the enemy is unless you know what your friend is, and you can't have a friend unless you have a sense of a people. And if you don't have a sense of a people, you can't have a sense of who the friend is. And this is, in some sense, one of the issues that American politics has had today. Canadian politics is much the same. Is, you know, England in some ways is better because there's a very clear idea who the friend is and who the enemy is. And this is why I think, you know, friend-enemy politics in England is going to emerge much more quickly than in the States. And then, you know, Schmitt argues that if you end up in a democratic society with friend-enemy politics, you're in a civil war. So maybe there is a sense of a people identifying, but if it does identify and it does come together, then you're going to end up in a situation where you're inevitably in either a cold civil war or an actual civil war. And that's really going to sense, and maybe because I've been going on for a bit too, and maybe throw it back to you and see if you have anything that you want to add, Athenian.
No, I mean, look, there's this is what's so fun about our conversations is that both of us bring so much to say about it that it's like, okay, well, now I got to catch up with everything. So, but here's what I would say. Um, the we have to understand too that the notion of the modern state that Hobbes, I mean, Schmitt sees in Hobbes. That's why Hobbes is so important. Is that he does recognize that that is a very powerful way forward that can work. And we also have to understand that Schmitt believes that Hobbes is in fact a sincere Christian. And so that's why it might be able to work, this enlightened sovereign despot. Now, because of the use of science to really found this thing we call modern liberalism, the science of governance, we have to be completely clear-eyed about what we're talking about. That is a new understanding of human reason. In other words, and so let's be even more clear, it's a new understanding of logos, right? That's going to be the key, because prior to modernity, the question of all politics, right? I mean, this is Plato and Aristotle 101. The question of political philosophy is very simply stated, very incredibly difficult to answer, is, are there any laws, nomoi, that are by nature, by physis? And the whole purpose of logos, at least according to Plato and Aristotle, is that we find a way to understand this thing we know of as nature, physis. And so that's what's going to be, again, that is why Schmitt becomes so incredibly helpful, because he has understood this change in human reason. The issue, though, is whether or not he has sufficiently understood the radical nature of Hobbes and the kingdom of darkness, right? That's going to be the issue. In other words, is this thing that Weber has outlined of secularization, does that fully capture what has happened? Or has it in fact been something that is just flatly anti-biblical, right? That's going to be the question. Now, with regard to America, well, let's go back to the notion of the individual, right? Because this is what Weber has made just incredibly popular with that the essay on the politics as a vocation. Weber describes, and this is just hilarious. I mean, I can't emphasize enough. I hope people read this essay in conjunction with when they're reading Schmitt, because, by the way, Schmitt is going to get this notion of liberalism being a so-called iron prison or iron cage. He's getting that exactly from Weber's most popular work, The Protestant Work Ethic, which hasn't. The Protestant Work Ethic is, of all of Weber's work, that's the one that sort of has not really survived the criticism. But he's still extremely worth reading. And this is what Weber says about the problem of, and Weber isolates America and says what's happened in America is radically new. And this notion of individualism, and Nietzsche himself, and he's getting this from Nietzsche, by the way, this individualism. Well, okay, hold on a second. Full stop. Individuated from what? Right? Where's the people? Right? You're individuals, but do you even understand that you can't have what you think are proper parts, individuals, unless you have a proper understanding of the whole from which they are parts, right?
That is such a good point, Athenian. I should have been obvious, but it's just sort of like when you say it, it's like duh, because I've said the same thing. You can't know yourself unless you're in community. But the idea of the individual doesn't even make sense unless you presuppose the idea of the community.
And the founding of America, this is what Weber and Schmitt have in mind. Now, we always have to be careful when we talk about the founding of America. There's an enormous amount of confusion out there. Which founding are we talking about? Are we talking about are we talking about the discovery of America, right, with the Puritans and everything? Or are we talking about the founding by way of what we would know as the founding generation with the Federalist Papers, et cetera? That's going to be what Schmitt. Schmitt has both of these things in mind because Weber has both. Weber talks all about the Puritans, and then he also talks all about the founders. Now, this is what Weber hilariously said, and you can't help but laugh because he just nails it, and he nails it with these phrases that it's no wonder that you get people like Schmitt, who are these deep thinkers, in dialogue with Weber, because this is what he says. This is what he says of Gladstone, of all people, with regard to Cromwell. He said, this is in reference to what has happened in America. He says, what you end up getting, he says, it soon becomes obvious that a Caesarist plebiscitarian arises. So he's saying what happens because of the use of speech and the rise of let's be even more clear, the rise of the party machine that takes the individual, right, this mysterious individual, that really just makes him almost obsolescent. He can vote and do whatever, but I mean, it's not going to make much change because the party machine is what's really producing the outcome of these elections. In other words, the technology. And he's saying what you end up having it's just these Caesars, but they're not even noble. They're just plebiscites. They have no clue what the hell they're even doing. They're clueless. And that's going to be the key. But again, Nietzsche, in his own notebooks, towards the middle period of his writing, he's using the word individual as he's trashing it, but he even starts scratching out the prefix in German for the in, right? In other words, taken away from, right? So it's no longer individuals. He's marking out the indie part, saying, no, you're not. And let's think about that word in English. Individuals, independent, right? You are, in other words, autonomous people. No. That's exactly what Schmitt is arguing against. He's saying, no, the sovereign is that which is autonomous. That's where these so-called individuals should understand themselves in relationship to. And again, that's going to fundamentally come down to this notion of, as he says, the friends and the enemies and things like that. Because well, anyway, I've said a lot, so please.
But that also dovetails. It's interesting. It all comes back to the Lord of the Ring. But it's interesting that the characters that get fully rendered in the Lord of the Rings are the hobbits, right? They have an interior life. You hear their thoughts. You see their thoughts. The hobbits get fully rendered, but Aragorn is always an archetype. He's always apart and removed. He's the good king. You need him there, but he's not really a part of the people, right? And that, in that sense, like you're saying, that the true individual, distinct from the people, apart from law, who is the intermediary between the metaphysical, between God and the people for their own good, who can declare law, that's the one who stands apart from the people. And so, but see, the thing is, with popular sovereignty, you then say, no, all of society, every individual is sovereign, stands apart from the people, and is not part of the people. He writes his own law. And so then, the idea then is you have all these sovereign individuals who then are supposed to engage in conversation. And out of that, a kind of collective truth is supposed to emerge, which Schmitt argues is just laughable. It all breaks down into, like, as you say, into factioning, manipulate. What ends up happening in practice is that this mass of individuals who believe themselves to be sovereign are manipulated by propaganda, and for the sake of others. But then, see, like as you say too, though, the leaders are not allowed to actually be a noble class because they have to present themselves as just as plebeian as the plebs, because they're part of that's in a sense the lie that gets promulgated. And then, as you say, this hems in the leader because he can't really lead and because he's supposed to be one of the people who's put on the throne by the people. And this is in a sense why Schmitt in many ways calls this whole thing the anti-state, because he says there's no one out there protecting the people. Like there's no one protecting the people from the predations. And he says largely, and he nailed it, like he says from the predations of the business interests. He says business interests will act in a predatory way to people. And he says the only thing that can really protect the interests of the people against predation, from within, is a strong state in the led by a strong sovereign and a noble class that are above and separated from this desire to make money. And he's very explicit about that in Legality and Legitimacy, that the noble class is there to protect people from the businessmen. And in that sense, he's essentially right. But I think part of the problem, and I know Americans will bristle and say that, but in many ways, although there is real culture, there is real organic community in the U.S. And there's you have the founding communities, you have the Southern culture, Northern culture. There's always been real community, small towns with real culture. All of that stuff exists. But as a whole, as a larger people entity, America as a people is largely a constructed entity. It's a machine-made artifact, and so it's in this sense that there isn't necessarily the same kind of organic life that Schmitt is talking about. Much of what is thought of as the life of the whole of the nation is put together through propaganda. I mean, Canada, where I'm from, has gone through the same sort of thing in the 60s, where Canada was rebuilt propagandistically. So you have these countries constructed out of things. Now, if you were looking, say, for a real body politic, you would say something like the Québécois in Quebec. They have a real political identity, and it's bound in a friend-enemy distinction. It's the French Québécois versus everyone outside of French Québécois. And they have a real political. So the French Canadians do politics. And even in some sense, Albertans in Canada, they do politics because they have their own identity that's we hate people from Ontario. So these are the kind of things, and they have their own elite class, and they have interests, and there's much more sense of a people out there. So there is this sense as to what degree in America is there organic identity, and perhaps they're forming in the present. Perhaps these identities are emerging, where friends band together and say, we have a shared existential life. And if they do, though, conflict is going to ensue from that. And that's really what Schmitt is saying, is that if you have if the friend-enemy distinction is there, conflict and war is an ever-present reality, because you have an existential life that you're defending against the outsider, against the other, against the enemy. And you then have to defend it till you can establish a sense of peace with your neighbor. But the conflict is always there. And so I think that is in many ways, we think the friend-enemy distinction is so much more than just political people that I don't like. Because it renders it a very superficial kind of concept, whereas Schmitt was trying to look at sort of what are the fundamental groundings of society, and what is it that lends political legitimacy. Well, he says political legitimacy, the legitimacy of the state can only be founded in its expression of its desire to protect the people from enemies both within and without.
Yeah. And again, so let's reemphasize for everyone listening. Schmitt is defending, in what he considers to be the best way possible, what we think of as the political, the concept of the political. He is defending it against these what he argues, and I personally think it's hard to disagree with what he's arguing against, the monstrosities of what liberalism does, because we have to understand liberalism. Liberalism, that is a euphemism for the manifestation in politics of modern science. The entire project of modernity, the entire project of modernity in politics was promised to us based on the results of modern science. That's why Hobbes in the Leviathan goes on and on about science and cause and effect. That's why John Locke writes this enormous tome of an essay on human understanding, right? It's all based in modern science. That's why they all do it, because they're saying, look, our science is right. And now, and just look around you at the world, look what our science has given us. Now let's consider what science can give us in politics. And that's the atrophying effect. That's the problematic effect. And that's what Schmitt means when he's arguing against it, precisely because, I mean, those two key words that Schmitt uses are the neutralization of the political and the depoliticization of things that would otherwise be healthy politics. Just to sort of just drive this home just one last time, because I mean, again, because he's in dialogue. You have to understand he is in dialogue with Weber, because he's against Weber's solution. Weber has put his finger on the pulse of all of it, but he balked. Weber still tried to defend a realm in which liberalism could still be possible. He's going to call this the fact-value distinction, right? We have a realm of values, and then we have a realm of facts. Science takes place in the realm of facts. Politics takes place in the realm of values. However, that distinction is fundamentally untenable. This is me speaking. That distinction is fundamentally untenable because you can't separate facts from values. Their facts are determined by our values. But this is what Schmitt said, or this is what Weber says in that very lecture when he's talking about the problem of the machine, just making it impossible for modern liberalism or the individual to even really take any kind of meaningful action politically. What he says, he says effectively, he says, for the problem is simply how the problem is simply how it is that the warm passion, right, the warm passion of us being involved in politics and the cool sense of proportion be forged together in one and the same soul. So how do we do that, right? This is Weber's solution to still be able to save liberalism. And he says, politics is made with the head, not with the other parts of the body and soul. And he says, and yet devotion to politics, if it's not to be frivolous intellectual play, must rather genuinely human conduct. He says it can be born and nourished from passion alone. He says, however, the firm taming of the soul, which distinguishes the passionate politician and differentiates him from the sterile excited, in other words, the zealot, he says, and mere political dilettante, he says, is possible only through the habituation of detachment in every sense of the word. He says the strength of a political personality means, in the first place, the passion of these qualities of passion, responsibility, and proportion. And then what he goes on to say is he says that just is gutted by the whole process of liberalism. So it's almost like there's a kind of schizophrenia taking place in his essay there about all this. He says, whosoever contracts with violent means for whatever ends, and then he inserts a clause and he says, and every politician does this, he says, is exposed to its specific consequences. And so that's, again, where he's throwing out the possibility of an ethic of ultimate ends, which for Weber is emblematic of the Sermon Mount. And he's saying, no, we've got to replace it by an ethic of responsibility. And remember, he's talking to the youth. And what he's saying is that ethic of responsibility, you guys want to get see, this is the thing with the youth. The youth want to be part of a cause. And now with nihilism, which Weber is accepting in many respects, he's struggling with it. It actually caused him to have a breakdown the same way Nietzsche did. But he's saying with that, people find it hard to believe in things. He says that's going to be so problematic. And he says this development is especially rapid. Now he's talking again about, this is about America and the machines. He says this development is especially rapid with struggles of faith because they are usually led or inspired by genuine leaders. That is, prophets of revelation. He says, for here, as with every leader's machine, one of the conditions for success is the depersonalization and routinization, in short, the psychic proletarianization in the interest of discipline. He says, after coming to power, the following of a crusader usually degenerates very easily into a quite common stratum of spoilsmen. In other words, grifters, people just have the money. And that right there is what Schmitt is fundamentally saying, okay, Weber, you were right there, but you're wrong that we can salvage this, because the machine, right, the party machine, technology in politics, liberalism, is so rapid you failed to understand it. And so we need something new going forward. And that's going to be exactly as you've been mentioning in the ways that you've brought it out directly from Schmitt, of absolute obligation to the state, etc., the sovereign, what the modern state is supposed to be, instead of what Weber has defined the modern state to be as mere machine efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway,
well,
sorry, I just
no, and it's interesting too, because when you read again an author like a Lowell, who you can tell although again because of Schmitt's associations, because he was a striver and he joined the Nazi Party because it gave him advantage, at least for a period. It was in the 50s, especially when Lowell was doing a lot of his writing, it was dangerous to quote Schmitt directly. But you can see overtures like, oh my word, I've read this before in Schmitt, where so that in many ways Lowell is dialoguing, and he's dialoguing with Weber and others when he's talking about the machine and the machine politics. Because you're absolutely right. In many ways, what the machine is looking to do is to replace the vagaries of the moral quality of different persons. So you then, by instituting a rule of law, by instituting the machine, we can protect society from corrupt individuals. And this, you see this in an early form, because the American Constitution and it emerges right in this period when the technological society is emerging. So it's a very proto form of the American Constitution is basically, and all constitutions are basically technologies, and the rule of law is a technology. And so when you think about it, an organic law, system of law, and Schmitt would talk about this as customary law. So in a sense, we've existed together as a long time as a people, and we've all grown up together. Everybody knows this is how we do things around here. And that's basically what custom does. It says, this is how we do things. And everybody knows how we do things. Now, memory is only so big, right? So you get, the chief, the judge, whatever, will make a ruling, and he'll say, listen, based on custom and what we've always done around here, I'm going to articulate it and put it into it. And legislation will do the same thing. So you'll have certain portions of this communal law that are then written down, and they form sort of the written portion of this kind of collective memory. So what a constitution does as a technology is it takes the history of the people, the character of the people, and elements from history. It abstracts them and says, can we take these out, refine them, turn them into a system? And largely, what is the American Constitution striving to achieve? Well, it's striving to protect the individuals from the powerful to it as a means of preventing them from accumulating power and wielding it over people unjustly. And so how do you do that? Well, you develop a series of competing institutions that will allow individuals to come into these institutions and then grab a certain amount of power, but then they're limited and resisted by others within the system. So you develop the way to solve the vagaries and the ambitions and the evil within people is to put in place a system that pits them off against each other and thus keeps their power in check through a balance of power that way. And that's, and then you have rules and procedures. Now, as that grows and elevates out from there, it develops into a whole system of law where the idea is then that the law itself rules society. But ultimately at the heart, you have replaced the laws that exist within the people, and as it's instantiated in certain written laws, with a technology that then is placed over society, that then now this machine governs society. So the system of governments, the rule of parliamentary democracy, and there's all these internal tensions with it. But the idea is that if we get the machine right, it will prevent the dictator from arising. It will prevent the authoritarian from arising. It will prevent our rights as individuals from being infringed upon in this sort of anti-society kind of way. And so the technology of law and governance exist as the solution to political conflict in that regard within the society. And also then as a way to prevent the problems of power from emerging within the society, right? But it doesn't necessarily then, and this is why, Schmitt, by rooting it in a very different, like, they're almost in a sense answering different questions, because Schmitt says that, well, that's not really a foundation for a society. Like, that's not really a society. You just have a technology and people are kind of living under this technology and they're somehow protected by it. But in the end, who's looking out for the people and the welfare and the long-term good of the people? And so Schmitt then comes back to the people and says that this shared collective consciousness that you have as a people, as an identity that says we're willing to die for one another to protect ourselves as a people, that in a sense is something that you can anchor society in. And then he says, well, then if the state then is the expression of that sentiment, then the state exists as a vehicle for protecting the people. So then the people that participate in the state then have to be exemplars of who this people are, like, in a sense, the model, the highest form of this society as its exemplaries, who then they strive as sort of in a detached way above the people to protect this existential way of life that we have together as a shared people. And from this, then, the friend-enemy distinction, anyone who's not a friend is automatically an enemy. And there are, and then it becomes, the will to survive as a people, and in this sense, it's almost a counter to Nietzsche. The heroic individual gets supplanted by the heroic people, and the heroic people then are the ones that can hold off the enemy and survive and exist and thrive as a people.
Yeah. So, So let's be perfectly clear about that. Is that the claim of the technology that is liberalism, and this is what
Yes.
Schmitt and Weber, by the way, are working
and
against.
Lewell and others, yeah.
And also, by the way, just to give some your listeners some meat on the bone of what you had mentioned about a written constitution itself being a technology. This is something I go into great detail about in one of my projects that I'm doing right now. What was happening, a lot of people forget this. Well, a lot of people don't even know it exists. This notion of romanticism, a lot of people say it originates with Rousseau. What Rousseau wrote, in addition to the famous first and second discourse or what have you. It's the origins of language itself, because Rousseau is fundamentally concerned with, this is the whole purpose of the first discourse, is the question of whether or not technology and the arts have improved us morally or not. And Rousseau, at the high tide of the Enlightenment, Rousseau says, no, they have not. And then Rousseau goes on later to even further clarify his thought, writing this essay about what are the origins of language itself, because language is a technology, and that is going to take the world by storm. Herder in German, right? This is, I mean, we're at ground zero of Romanticism. Herder is they're going to start asking these similar questions from universities in Germany. You're going to have people like Kant responding with their essays on the origins of language. Herder's responding. And all of this is because it's a notion of technology, this writing. And in fact, what's so wonderful about this is the so-called great romantics, Byron and Shelley, etc. People have missed the fact that in Shelley's Frankenstein, now this is Mary Shelley, but still, in Shelley's Frankenstein, the monster himself, and I'm doing a massive project on this right now, the monster himself is most concerned with what he refers to as, he calls it that divine science of learning how to read words that have been written down. He's like, they can communicate that way. So that's how important all of this is. But let me just simply say, this is what this is what, again, this is Weber. But Schmitt is saying, you are exactly right. This is the problem of liberalism. Weber, this is where he says, this machine may also be brought under domination of the party officials in whose hands the regular business rests. He says, according to the view of some social democratic circles, their party has succumbed to this bureaucratization. He says, the officials submit relatively easy to the leader's personality if it has a strong demagogic appeal. So we're in the realm of the power of words and speech, charisma. And he says, the material and the ideal interest of the officials are intimately connected with the effects of party power, which are expected from the leader's appeal. And so what he's saying is that regular people will easily fold, right? You just have to have a powerful enough party figurehead for the machine to do its work, right? Just get someone's got a powerful enough personality. And that is exactly what Schmitt is saying. Look, you guys are saying that, liberalism is going to be all this great stuff, but what I'm telling you is it is depoliticized, it's neutralized the areas in which human flourishing in the political actually can take place. And so we don't get this great freedom society. What we get are these societies that are so technologically advanced by way of machinery, party machinery, that you get, as Weber had said, these Caesarist plebiscitarians, which is hilarious. And this is why, and I'll sort of end with this. I know we're running short on time now. This is why it is so absolutely crucial, because what you were saying with Ellul being in dialogue, with Weber, with Schmitt, that dialogue, and why I've had to have so much recourse to Weber in this discussion is because we live at a time when these absolute morons will shout you down if you even mention Schmitt. Every single English translation, by the way, of Schmitt's work, I'm going through all of these. I went through them in preparation for this discussion. On the first page, and I'm trying not to use vulgarity, on the first damn page of the intro to every single one of them, they always find it necessary to say Schmitt, a Nazi, by the way, Schmitt the Nazi. In other words, they do not believe that we can even have serious discussion about what was only the greatest and most important discussion taking place with all of these guys without pointing out and saying, hey, some of these guys were bad guys. Well, okay, you know what? I got news for you. The history of mankind is one of people who are good guys and bad guys. But just because someone might be a bad guy, or you might claim they're a bad guy, if they have made enormous impact, if we disregard what the reading and the studying of their work, then we're screwed, because we are condemned to repeat the errors of the past. And what they're doing by trying to shout people down, saying, no, you know, Schmitt was a Nazi, blah, blah, blah. What they're doing is literally no different than what Schmitt, Weber, Nietzsche, what all these people were saying. You know what? That is what has ruined us as a people. So these so-called moral protectors, right, the democracy dies in darkness people of the New York Times, these sanctimonious, mere moralizers don't even realize that what they are doing is absolutely creating the precondition for all of it to repeat all over again. And that's why it is absolutely crucial that we discuss and we take seriously the thought of these extremely thoughtful people.
Well, and it's I pulled out my bookmark now just as we were winding down, but the idea that where Schmitt talks about, he says that the concept of the state presupposes the concept of the political. And, you know, for those who still want to kind of cling to this idea of individualism, which is a myth, what Schmitt is arguing is that once you understand the concept of the political and you have a real identifiable people, and the state is thus an expression of the existential desire for the people to survive, that the state, as an expression of the people in this regard, ceases to be oppressive in this regard. And whereas with the individual who believes himself to be free and autonomous is manipulated via the technology of the state, and because democracy requires, mass democracy requires propaganda to manipulate you. I've talked about this elsewhere. And so this so-called autonomous individual is constituted and made into a mass for the purpose of political manipulation to give rise to the plebiscite. So maybe, and we're getting along in time too. But the difference between, and this is important for Schmitt, between a democracy and a plebiscite. In a democracy, Schmitt argues, you as the citizenry are determining the agenda that is discussed among the people. Whereas in a plebiscite, he says, an agenda is given to you from on high, and you just simply vote yes or no. And so you're voting, but your will as a people is completely discarded. Like, your existential identity as a people is completely discarded. You are being manipulated by the demagogue, as you say, through words and images and so forth, through propaganda. You are being manipulated and formed into a mass for the power of the machine and to preserve the power. And so the demagogue plays his role in the machine. But really, Ellul says, is that the elite, the idea of the leadership, has been replaced by the system. And Schmitt recognizes this as well, too, when he talks about in Legality and Legitimacy, and he talks about the role of, administrative power versus, administrative law and so forth. But the machine, everyone sort of plays their role in the machine. So even somebody like Trump is just playing the role of the leader in the system as it's been set up, and you legitimize the system by giving the vote. But really what's ruling you is the system, the technology of the Democrat, the rule of law, the technology of the state. Everyone plays their role in it, and you give your assent to this because you've been manipulated by propaganda into giving your yes to the demagogue, who then plays the part of the dictator, right, or of the leader. But the real leader, the real leadership class, it's not even persons. The real leadership class is vested in the system of law, the system of government, parliamentary democracy, the state apparatus that then gives policy to the politicians who then present them to the people for a vote. And Schmitt says that everyone in that regard plays their role, and you as a people then give legitimacy to it, but you're basically manipulated into it through propaganda. And so you have all of these authors like Weber and Schmitt and others and Ellul and so forth telling you that the system isn't what it seems to be. And the way to break out of this, you're not even doing politics anymore. You're just a machine in an anti-society. And the way to do politics is to reclaim, or would be to reclaim for yourself a sense of collective identity. Who are we as friends? What's our shared existential? And this, by the way, and this is one of the reasons why I think in part the future is Christian. Where do you find the most identifiable sense of self-identity? Is within the churches. And this is one of the reasons why churches being told that, well, you can't do politics, listening to Weber. If you are a community with an existential self of existence, you're already a political body. And this is in some sense like this idea of the kingdom of God, and we as part of the kingdom of God acknowledges this very political nature of the church. The church is by nature is a political body. And so if you say, well, we as the community of believers have a shared existential existence. Now the question, and this is fundamentally, I think probably more so than any other place around, is Americans have a weird tie between, have a hard time separating themselves, in terms of, I mean, Russians probably have the same thing too with orthodoxy, but separating the state from the community of believers as a political identity. Whereas when you look at the scripture in the Old Testament, or in the New Testament especially, there was a very strong sense of identity. And Schmitt gets at this in the Political Theology, where he talks about the love your enemies. But Schmitt said, the scriptures say love your enemies, but it doesn't say surrender to them. Nowhere have we ever as a church surrendered to our enemies. We may have loved our enemies, but we haven't surrendered to them. And so you get that. So I think there's a lot in this regard, as you say. Schmitt in his own way is trying to rescue the idea of politics from liberalism, in some ways by trying to bring Christian ideas into the modern era and put them to service in a post-Nietzschean world. He's probably not always successful in doing it, but I think that's my sense of it, is that's the attempt that he's trying to make, is to bring some of these older Christian ideas into this realm of the political in a post-Nietzschean world. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
no. Let me just emphasize something for the listeners about what you just said, because this goes back to what I had been emphasizing with Weber. The Sermon on the Mount. Weber is the example for Weber. Schmitt also heavily is concerned that we properly understand what the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount is. And that's so absolutely crucial for everything. And just so, and we probably should have begun with this when you were mentioning a second ago, this is so typical of us, we just dive right into the depths. This is what we should have said at the very beginning, because this is everything. This is literally everything for Schmitt. It's literally the opening sentence of the concept of the political. He says the concept of the state presupposes the concept of the political. In other words, the political, look, if you get the political wrong, you've gotten everything wrong. And then skip just one paragraph. That sentence, by the way, is its own paragraph. Skip one paragraph, and there he says it. He says, in its literal sense and in its historical appearance, the state is a specific entity of a people. He says, vis-a-vis the many conceivable kinds of entities, it is, in the decisive case, the ultimate authority. So the state presupposes the political. the political, or the state or whatever, right? I mean, these are absolutely logically connected, is fundamentally dependent upon this entity that we know of as a people, right?
That's right. And their existential desire to continue as a people. So the state is the instantiation of a people's desire to exist, their existential desire to continue as a people. And so the state becomes the institutional instantiation of a people's desire to persist.
Exactly. And so when that people allows that manifestation by way of institutions to be a machine, then what you end up with, Schmitt is explicit about this, Weber is explicit about this, what you end up with,
yeah,
right, exactly. What you end up with is a soulless people, right? I mean, that is what a machine is. It is soulless. It is utterly artificial. And what Schmitt is trying to do that Weber did not, and Weber, by the way, points out in that essay, he says, it's wonderful to sort of back up your point. He says, Weber says, this is 1918. He says, William James himself told me recently that about 15 or 20 years ago, everything was determined by religious affiliation to the church. He said that was the way America worked. He said, but it's not like that anymore because the machine, the Industrial Revolution, the machine has so rapidly taken that over that it's not like that anymore. And this is where Weber has this kind of defeatism, and he's like, so we need to go forward, and those days are gone, etc. What Schmitt is doing is he's saying, no, we can bring those days back, but it's going to take a very powerful unknotting of our stomach, because people are going to have to become much more clear-eyed about what this thing that they believe that is so great, in other words, liberal democracies, is exactly that which is causing the enslavement of them. And let's be specific, by the enslavement of them, Schmitt has in mind, I mean, he's got an essay in the concept that they added it to the concept of the political about Descartes and construction, right, of politics, etc., is the machine, soullessness, right? You no longer have a soul. You as a people no longer have a soul.
Well, and this is the sense of, and this is where you dovetail into like modern situation with mass immigration, is that if the state is a machine, people can simply be built machine-like. So you can build a people mechanistically. And so you can simply construct a society, and you can bring people in from everywhere, and you can just build a society. And this has been going on now for 100 years, and more, with more greater intensity for the last 20 to 25. But this idea, if society is a machine, then it can just simply, we're all cogs in the machine, we can be built. And this is really, I think, where the question, and maybe one of the most important questions we have today, and is this question of like, what is a Canadian? What is an American? What is a Brit? What is a Dutchman? What is a German? What is a Dane? That these are, in many ways, the most fundamental, and this is really, when people are asking these questions, they're getting at the fundamental political question. And this is really where the conflict is going to come. So, and it is telling that as an entity, there is no unifying answer in the United States to the question of what is an American. And even people who have a sense of like, they think they know and they maybe know, can't put an answer to it. But in some sense, it should almost be like, it almost shouldn't have to be said or asked, what is an American? But the fact that you're asking the question is already problematic. That now you have, like, this is a real existential crisis. The fact that you can't answer this question.
Yeah, let me use that as a segue to our previous discussion, for instance, about Marx. And this will also dovetail directly into this notion of romanticism, which, again, I've got so much to say about it. I mean, people are missing the goods when they don't emphasize all the various manifestations of romanticism and how important it was. Rousseau is the one who gives us the word bourgeois. And what Rousseau says is that the bourgeois is exactly the problem of liberalism, because the bourgeois man is a nothing. He only knows how to understand himself by way of how he thinks other people view him, right? And in addition to that, he can only view other people in terms of himself. And then he goes further and he says, and this is in a different writing, he says, I look around me today and I have yet to see a Frenchman, an Englishman, a German, right? He says they don't exist anymore because everyone has become this bourgeois, right? Now in America, I mean, the communists are always going to be talking about the bourgeois, but let's actually be serious about this. It is so problematic still. We fool ourselves to think that we haven't solved this problem of the bourgeois. This is enormously problematic. In other words, we haven't solved the problem of what we are as a people, right? Because liberalism that's what it's intended to do, is eliminate that. That's Schmitt's whole point, is that it eliminates conflict. So you eliminate any notion of fundamental distinctions where you're like, hey, that's not what we do here. What everyone in America will talk about is they won't call themselves bourgeois, but they're happy to call themselves middle class. Like, yeah, I mean, look, I'm a middle class man. Well, hold on a second. Let's better understand this middle class phrase, because it just might be a euphemism for bourgeois. Now, that's not to say that the middle class is a bad thing. Rather, what that is to say is we better get a freaking answer to this question of the bourgeois, because then there's nothing shameful or to be embarrassed about if you recognize yourself, your identity as a people, right? Say, I'm an American, right? Or I'm a Canadian, or I'm a Frenchman. That's what I am, right? It doesn't matter how much money I make or something like that. We'll talk about that later. But I am fundamentally of my people. I am not individuated from them. And see, that's where the stuff with Marx and everything goes so absolutely wrong, for any number of reasons. But I mean, it's the whole purpose is to divide people, right? Just that word, divide a people by way of material circumstances or those sorts of things, right? If you have a strong understanding of yourself as a people, you're not able to be divided along those kinds of lines. And that's what Schmitt's getting at. That's what Weber's getting at. That's what Ellul's getting at. That's what they've seen. They said, no, we don't have to go down this road of communism or Marxism or something like that, because there's something more foundational than us being separated by monetary things. And what that more foundational thing, Schmitt is going to call the friend and enemy distinction, which otherwise we would understand as an answer to the question of what we are as a people, right? What unites us. So,
well, and in this regard, and yeah, we have, I think, several times decided, oh, we should try to end this, but there's always a little bit more. But people have to understand that democracy itself actually prevents, if you don't have how to put it this way, if you don't already have a strong unitary society in which you have a really, really depth understanding of what unites us as a people, democracy will fundamentally divide. And even over time, I think that what happens with democracy in a society is that it undermines, and this is Schmitt makes this argument, is that it fundamentally divides an otherwise unified people by pitting them against each other in terms of party politics, because you get certain interests, and you place those interests over and above the welfare of the people. So your own private interests get placed over and above the welfare of the people, and then you're in this battle in this public arena, sort of battling against each other. And what happens is the otherwise unified society now becomes a series of oppositions that always then threaten to develop into politics, where this identity becomes existential. And once it's existential, then people are willing to die for their position. And once they're willing to die for their position, it becomes civil war. And so you always have in the democratic society now is this constant urge you're fighting always against this urge for society to break itself up by means of the democratic institutions. So then, in order to maintain a unitary society, you have to then do that through the exercise of force, which is, propaganda, the violence of the message, against the soul of the people to keep them unified in this. And ideally, and this, I think the left understands this in some way, that this idea that someone should disagree with them because they're always striving for this unitary society, but they're imposing it technologically. But as you hold on to democracy, you are then pitting either different classes against each other, and you no longer have an expression of a unified society. And so in this sense, democracy really becomes a sort of a fundamental enemy of the people as a structural. And this is the other thing that Schmitt is arguing, is that democratic institutions become kind of an enemy of the people. And Ellul says it in a different way. He talks about the state as an enemy, because from a systematic point of view. But Schmitt specifically, looking at it from the point of view of the political, and as you say, the concept of the state presupposes the concept of the political, is that if the state is fundamentally democratic and a democratic system, it will undermine its own foundation, which is the unity of the people and its existential unity. And this is where you get to a point today where nobody can answer the question, what is an American? And because nobody can answer the question, what is an American, you no longer have a legitimate unifying expression in the state. And you're having a growing existential conflict as people begin to develop real identities that are stronger than that of I'm an American. Like you can see it now today, even where the idea that I'm a Republican or I'm on the right is, in some sense, I'm a right-wing American is more important than I'm a left-wing American. You can see these identities beginning to fracture. They're still using the language of America, but there's already a growing sense of existential, that we begin to know who we are as opposed to who they are.
Exactly.
And then, so now you're locked into an existential battle for existence and for the future. So either you divide and separate, or one defeats the other. Right. So you can establish that unitary society upon which the state legitimately is an expression of the desire for that people to continue existing. Yeah. Maybe let's end it there. I guess, Athenian, we could probably go on for hours. There's just so much here.
Yeah. Yeah. And let me just also emphasize, we have been emphasizing the concept of the political because that's where the friend-enemy distinction shows itself most. What happens is that people just like to criticize. And so you're going to have people who will say, well, that's early Schmitt. They didn't take into consideration late Schmitt, blah, blah, blah. Look, we have to start somewhere. We have to focus on something. We can talk about broad overviews or things like that. But I hope that people understand that what we are doing is trying to stay as focused as possible in a short time without, going into this entire encompassing discussion of all of Schmitt's thought or something like that. So those things always have to be said, unfortunately, because people always just want to sort of criticize or something like that. But
wow, and in many ways, his early thought is his most influential thought. Yeah. Nomos. The Nomos is his last book is like very few people read that. It's all of that sort of core corpus that he developed sort of between the two world wars that really form the backbone of what people think of Schmitt and the ideas that he put forward that still resonate today. So, and I think the concept of the political and the idea of the friend-enemy distinction are vitally important to understand probably. That's why we have this discussion, because I think in misunderstanding it and misapplying it, you are not understanding then the current context within which you're living. And if you're not understanding the current context within which you're living, you sort of everything, sort of how what are you supposed to do in this context begins to fall apart, or you begin to take wrong paths or whatever. But once you properly understand the idea of the friend, the political, the friend-enemy distinction, and the role of the state as an expression of the people, with an existential desire to continue, and you understand how this works within Schmitt, that then you can then use that as a tool, as a means to properly understanding the context within which we find ourselves today and the political battles that Americans are finding themselves wrapped up to, and what is happening. Because in some ways, they're not even really political battles, which is the funny thing, right?
Yeah.
Because they're not battles over fundamental existence. They're a different sort of conflict. And what kind of conflict they are different, but Schmitt would argue they're not political.
Exactly.
Because they're not existential.
Exactly. Is that, in other words, what the arguments that we see taking place they're called political, but they're so superficial because they don't understand, the title of the text, right? What the concept of the political truly is. And that's why these things are so helpful. So.
Well, and then even just to maybe make it a little newsy, and I think this is one of the things that you're seeing, but, and this is why understanding the concept of the political is important, because you could say that perhaps in the death and response to the death of Charlie Kirk, that is there something of the political emerging there? Or the other question would be, or is his death being used to manipulate the masses from on high? Is it real political? Is it organic? Or is it manipulated? Or is it a combination of both? And in what ways and how does that mean? Because that in many ways is an important question of the moment. Like, are we seeing the emergence of the political? Because if you're seeing the emergence of the political, something real and substantial is happening. If it's not the political, then what is happening?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Very good, Athenian. Well, as always, it's a pleasure to talk with you. And, in some ways I wish we lived closer, because it would be just fun to sit out for coffee day in and day out. And
that would be great.
Do this off air where we could really riff and let it go.
Exactly. Meet up for coffee or something in the morning, or go out for beers or something at night. That'd be just a blast. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. I always appreciate this, and it's never wasted on me. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. And thank you always for coming on. I've been very blessed by our long distance friendship and the chance that we have to share some of our discussions with a wider audience. So again, thank you. And to everybody. Oh, maybe just before you go, where can people find you online?
So you can find me on X, but I've transferred everything of my work, which is to say my lecture series and things like that. Man, that's what I do. Is I have these series on philosophy, whether it's an entire series, hours and hours of lecture on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, or whether it's Plato's laws. I have an awful lot about friendship in Aristotle, and that's what I'm going to be adding to with my own recent inquiries or researches into Schmitt, along with the thought of Leo Strauss and Nietzsche, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is on Substack. It's just Athens Corner, right? Find me at Athens Corner on Substack, and you can find all my stuff there.
Very good. All right. Take care, my friend.
You too, brother.